All right, we are in the book of Isaiah, chapter 5 this evening. And we had a few people that weren't here last time, so I figured I should explain this thing I've got on the board. Basically, these first 5 chapters in the book of Isaiah, what we have is kind of a tension between the nation of Israel as they are and the nation of Israel as they should be. A tension between the ideal and the actual. Israel, in reality, is a rebellious nation. They are a proud nation. They are a fruitless nation. And yet God depicts them as something God depicts them as something that they could be. He says that there is a situation where things can be much better in the future. In chapter 2, in verses 1 through 4, and in chapter 4, in verses 2 through 6, he has these exalted descriptions of Mount Zion. They're very short, they're both of similar length, and they both appear at these critical places in the text to describe what the future could be like for God's people. A restored people, a glorified people, a people that God dwells among and teaches among, and that they will all know Him because He is among them. And what we see, and you see in chapter 2, verse 4, for instance, that it entails an end to war. The swords and the spears, the weapons, are hammered into farming implements, plowshares and pruning hooks. In chapter 4, it's the same thing. The mountain of the Lord, it has a cloud over it by day and a pillar of fire by night. It's a recreation of the scene at Mount Sinai where God led His people and dwelled with His people and had a great fellowship with them. Now that's up through we got up through chapter 4 last time. So now we're in chapter 5, which covers the last thing I've got on the board, the fruitless Israel. And the way this starts off is Isaiah tells a parable of sorts about a vineyard, and he asks a basic question as a result of this parable. Beginning in verse 1, "Let me sing now for my well-beloved, a song of my beloved concerning his vineyard. My well-beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill. He dug it all around, removed its stones, and planted it with the choicest vine. And he built a tower in the middle of it. And he also hewed out a wine vat in it. Then he expected it to produce good grapes, but it only produced worthless ones. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard than that I have not done in it? Why, when I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones? So now let me tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will break down its wall, and it will become trampled ground. I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, but briars and thorns will come up. I will also charge the clouds to rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his delightful plant. Thus he looked for justice, but behold bloodshed. For righteousness, but behold a cry of distress." You got to love we think of parables as something that's associated with Jesus, but this is one in the Old Testament. It's designed to draw in the hearers and who would empathize with the farmer's efforts and his expectations. And then the tables are turned and the punchline is revealed. I'm talking about you, Isaiah says. He talks about the farmer plants a vineyard, and whenever a vine was planted, it took 2 to 4 years for grapes to be produced on it. And during that time, what's the farmer doing while he's waiting for the grapes? He's giving them their best shot. He surrounds it with a wall, which protects it from outside forces, outside elements. He builds a tower in the middle of it. What would that be for?
Look out for enemies.
Look out for enemies. Also suggests that he intends to live on site during the harvest. He's expecting this to be pretty big. He builds a wine vat, a very large wine vat, in order to process the grapes that he's expecting to collect. Do you think he's expecting to get something out of this vineyard? Of course he is. He anticipates a great harvest. Lots of grapes, good grapes, to make good wine. And then disappointment strikes because we don't have good grapes. We only have worthless grapes. We're not very agrarian in our society now, but they would have empathized with this guy's plight. Like, that's the worst thing that could happen to you. Put all this effort into a vineyard that didn't produce anything? And so Isaiah turns to the people and he asks them, make a decision. Go ahead, Jerusalem, judge between me and the vineyard. What should I do? What more was there to do? They all know the effort in farming. They know the expectation of an abundant crop. They know the frustration of an unfruitful harvest.
Oh, this God he's a God of destruction. He approves genocide. He told the Israelites to go kill all of the Canaanites, the poor innocent Canaanites, and then he destroyed the entire world with a great flood for no reason whatsoever.
And, really, what more was there to do? Again, it's, when you have a garden or a vineyard that's unfruitful, what do you do about it? What more was there to do? Well, it's a rhetorical question. The answer is nothing. The people would say nothing. If any one of them was farming that vineyard, you know what they would do? Exactly what he describes here. Tear it down, let it be consumed, start over somewhere else, because this soil is not going to produce grapes. It will, briars and thorns will come up. Charge the clouds to rain no rain on it. Nothing. Tear it up. Start over. And so Isaiah gives the verdict. Destroy the vineyard. Remove the wall. Trample the ground. The thorns and the briars. Thorns and briars is kind of a common expression in these first 12 chapters of Isaiah. And it really kind of recalls the curse of Genesis 3, whenever Adam sins and God says, the ground will only produce thorns and thistles for you all the days of your life. It's a return to the wild state that this vineyard had been in before it was cultivated. And then you even see in verse 6, at the end of the verse, the angry farmer calls on the clouds, "Don't rain on my vineyard," which, since this is coming from God, unlike the farmer, God actually has the power to make it not rain on this vineyard. He can control the weather. And so up to this point, the people would agree with Isaiah. Yeah, that's what you do in that situation. This vineyard is worthless. It takes up ground. Why waste any more effort? But then in verse 7, he interprets the parable for them. Who is the vineyard?
Israel.
Children of Israel. Israel is the vineyard. You guys are the vineyard, he says. The tables have turned. Whatever answer you gave about the vineyard in verses 3 and 4 is the answer that you have given about yourself. God is the one who planted Israel as a vineyard. He gave her protection. He anticipated a great harvest. He prepared for the bountiful fruit of his labor. And what happened? Israel did not produce good grapes, did they? They only produced worthless grapes. And what are these grapes? What if Israel's the vineyard in the analogy, what would the grapes be? Judah? Well, no, the house of Judah is also part of Israel as the vineyard. What's it say in verse 7? Justice and righteousness. He looked for justice, but behold, bloodshed. He looked for righteousness, but behold, a cry of distress. It sounds even cooler in Hebrew, by the way. There's a word play going on here. Justice, mishpat, and bloodshed, mishpak. Is kind of a play on that. Righteousness, tzedakah, and cry of distress, sa'aka. It sounds similar, but it's really completely the opposite of what God was looking for. And because of that, God calls on the destruction on this vineyard here. Now, any questions up through verse 7, or comments, or anything people want to interject? How are you getting that? I'm just wondering.
It says right there, and the men of Judah is delightful.
The vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his delightful plant. What you have here is kind of a syntactic parallelism where vineyard is parallel to delightful plant. House of Israel is parallel to men of Judah. He's not saying that Judah is better than Israel. He's lumping them in the same category. He's saying, that they were this vineyard. They were this delightful plant that he expected to receive good grapes from, but didn't. I don't think he's comparing. I don't think he's saying that Israel and Judah are somehow different here, because he has a lot of bad things to say about Judah later on. And when especially you start getting into chapter 7, 8, and 9, you see some of the things he says about Judah. This is the time. In this time in their history, we've got Uzziah and Jotham on the throne, and Uzziah was a good king, but he was proud, and he broke into the temple and did things he should not have done, and wound up being struck with leprosy. And Jotham was a good king, but he was unable to stop the inhabitants of the land from acting wickedly. It says in Kings and Chronicles. And then Ahaz, who's king after him, is just the biggest spiritual loser in their history, practically. We'll talk more about him when we get to chapter 7. But I don't think that Israel and Judah are being differentiated here, really.
When you look at many of these prophecies like this throughout the Old Testament, you'll see, I can't remember what it's called now, it's a poetic trick.
Parallelism?
Kind of a parallel. You're calling the same thing by two different names.
Right.
You see that a lot. And in this context, it might be a little bit iffy, but in many contexts, it's not iffy at all. He's talking about the same thing, but using two different names for them. So I think that you're correct here. Yeah.
Now, it's interesting that the vineyard imagery comes up a lot in the Old Testament. It's in Jeremiah several times. It's in Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 15, 17, and 19, which is like every other chapter at one point, Judah is the vineyard. They're the vine that God plants, and it's being uprooted by an eagle to one place, and it's been uprooted by an eagle to another place. Ezekiel depicts the vine as you can't make up your mind whether you want to be rooted in Egypt or whether you want to be rooted in Babylon. Also in Ezekiel, he talks about the vine wood. You never try to build something out of vine wood. That's not very effective, and especially not if the vine wood is already burnt. He says that's what Israel or Judah is like in Ezekiel 15. But in these illustrations in the prophets, the vine is almost always the nation of Israel. And sometimes Israel is just used for Judah. You see that in Jeremiah and Ezekiel and so on, because there's no northern Israel anymore, so he can use both terms to refer to the same group of people. But this is an agricultural image that they would understand. Bear fruit or perish. Now later on, of course, the vineyard and this agricultural imagery comes back when we discover the Assyrian trees are chopped down, but up from the stump comes the holy seed. In chapter 11 we have the root of Jesse, the shoot that springs up and bears fruit. Yes?
I just want to make sure. Israel in captivity right now, or is this before they're in captivity?
Okay, all right, yeah.
Who are they in captivity?
The chronology so far is, Isaiah is preaching mainly to Judah, but Israel still technically exists right now. They're on their last legs. And Pekah, the son of Remaliah, is mentioned in chapter 7. He is the next to last king of northern Israel. After Pekah is deposed, Hoshea is king for like 10 years, and then Shalmaneser and Sargon come and they destroy the city of Samaria and take the northern 10 tribes of Israel into captivity. But Isaiah is not really preaching to Israel. Isaiah is not really targeting northern Israel with his preaching. He's targeting Judah. He's in the court of these Judean kings and talking to them. And occasionally he'll point to northern Israel and use them as an object lesson or as an example, try to basically say, don't be like them, don't turn out like them, because the Assyrians are going to overflow them, but the flood of Assyria will reach even to your neck, Israel, he says. I think in chapter 8 he talks about that a little bit. That kind of answer that?
Yeah, I think so. So northern Israel's in captivity, but Judah is right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just to kind of, chronology, we didn't really talk about other prophets that Isaiah was contemporary with. But Hosea and Amos and Micah even a little bit are all also preaching it around the same time frame. Amos preaches in northern Israel. Hosea preaches in northern Israel. Micah preaches more in Judea, or Judah, in southern Judah, where Isaiah is. So that kind of gives you a time frame that we're working with here. I didn't incorporate the prophets into the timeline in the book, but maybe I'll do that in the next edition, which I publish 20 years from now or something. Okay. Now, there's one other passage in the Bible that talks about the vine or the vineyard. Actually, there's a couple of other passages. I mean, you think about John chapter 15, for instance, where Jesus says, I am the true vine. Well, Israel was a terrible vineyard. They failed, but Jesus says, I am the true vine. And those who abide in me and bear fruit, those branches get to stay. They get pruned so they bear more fruit. And those that do not bear fruit, what happens to those branches? They are cut off and thrown away. That's the whole basis. When Jesus talks about the vine and the branches in John 15, he's alluding to this image in Isaiah 5 here about fruitfulness. Jesus also uses this parable in another place in the New Testament. In Mark chapter 12. Let's read this in Mark 12 with me. Beginning in verse 1, Jesus began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard, put a wall around it, dug a vat under the winepress, and built a tower, and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. Any of that sound familiar? At the harvest time, he sent a slave to the vine growers in order to receive some of the produce of the vineyard from the vine growers. They took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent them another slave, and they wounded him in the head and treated him shamefully. He sent another, and that one they killed, and so with many others, beating some and killing others. He had one more to send, a beloved son. He sent him last of all to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But those vine growers said to one another, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." They took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine growers, and will give the vineyard to others. Have you not even read this scripture? The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And they were seeking to seize him, and yet feared the people, for they understood he spoke the parable against them. So they left him and went away. Now why would Jesus quote from Isaiah 5 when he tells them this parable here?
What Isaiah said to him was the same thing in Jesus' day.
What Isaiah said about the people in his day, mind you, is still true in the day of Jesus. Now, Jesus does change the parable up a little bit. When Isaiah tells it, it's Israel's the vineyard and they're not producing fruits. When Jesus tells it, he focuses more on the guys that God trusted to take care of his vineyard in his absence, and how the judgment will fall on them because they refuse to yield any of its fruit to him. To the point of even killing his son, which... Jesus said that hadn't even happened yet, and they still understood that he was jabbing at them, the religious people, the religious leaders of his day. The farmer sends his son, they kill him in hopes of stealing his inheritance. And, Jesus, the interpretation of the parable is pretty straightforward. The farmer is obviously God. The vineyard is still Israel. The vine growers are these Jewish leaders who've been entrusted with Israel and its care. The servants that God sends are the prophets. The Son is Jesus. And God's response to them rejecting His Son is to destroy these leaders and give their vineyard to somebody else. In one parable, Israel is a faithless vineyard that gets destroyed. And in the other parable, Israel's stewards are faithless and they're destroyed. And which one's true? Well, both of them are. You probably shouldn't press the metaphor too hard. But there's a sense in which the Israel itself is taken away from these leaders and given to others. Probably the Gentiles in that instance. All right, now that we've talked quite a bit about vineyard imagery, unless anybody's got anything else to add, I want to go back to chapter 5 of Isaiah and hit some of these woes. Reading verses 8 through 25. Woe to those who add house to house and join field to field until there's no more room, so that you have to live alone in the midst of the land. In my ears the Lord of hosts has sworn, surely many houses shall become desolate, even great and fine ones without occupants. For 10 acres of vineyard will yield only 1 bath of wine. A homer of seed will yield but an ephah of grain. Woe to those who rise early in the morning, that they may pursue strong drink, who stay up late in the evening, that wine may inflame them. Their banquets are accompanied by lyre and harp, by tambourine and flute, and by wine, but they do not pay attention to the deeds of the Lord, nor do they consider the work of His hands. Therefore my people go into exile for their lack of knowledge. Their honorable men are famished. Their multitude is parched with thirst. Therefore Sheol has enlarged its throat and opened its mouth without measure. And Jerusalem's splendor, her multitude, her din of revelry, and the jubilant within her descend into it. So man will be humbled and mankind abased. The eyes of the proud also will be ashamed. But the Lord of hosts will be exalted in judgment, and the holy God will show Himself holy in righteousness. Then the lambs will graze as in their pasture, and strangers will eat in the waste places of the wealthy. Woe Woe to those who drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood and sin as with cart ropes, who say, let him make speed, let him hasten his work that we may see it. Let the purpose of the Holy One of Israel draw near and come to pass that we may know it. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. Woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away the rights of the ones who are in the right. Therefore, as a tongue of fire consumes stubble and dry grass collapses into the flame, so their root will become like rot and their blossom blow away as dust. For they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. On this account, the anger of the Lord has burned against his people, and he has stretched out his hand against them and struck them down, and the mountains quaked, and the corpses lay like refuse in the middle of the street. For all this his anger is not spent, but his hand is still stretched out. It's a mouthful. What's he condemning here? What would you say is the main thing that these woes are all condemning?
Idle rich who think that they are rich by divine right, so to speak. That
Yeah.
I have a right to my station in life.
Well, yeah, more or less. I mean, you're looking at a group of people who are becoming more and more attuned to their pleasurable self-indulgences and less attuned to God's will. They're more interested in the stuff that they can get and the stuff that they have a right to, or the stuff that they want, than they are in serving the Lord of heaven.
I have a right to be happy.
Exactly. It's all about being, it's this false idea that the main purpose in life is to be happy. To enjoy life. Because you only go around once, so grab all the gusto you can get. Well, the Bible knocks that idea pretty hard. And this is primarily described as a problem among the wealthy. Amos 3, Amos 4, Amos 6 talks about this too. You think about what Jesus said, Matthew 16, verse 26. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? What can a man give in exchange for soul? Well, nothing. Nothing's more valuable than that. And ultimately, all wealth belongs to God anyway. More specifically, he goes through these woes. Greediness. He talks about adding house to house and joining field to field. What does that mean? Adding house to house, joining field to field. We're talking about property expansions, basically.
Well, I think it's a little more than that. It's that he's buying up other people's properties to add to his. He's kind of cheating other people to get their properties to add to his.
Now, here's something. Question for those who were paying attention in the classes on the law that we have been having for the last 2 years on Sunday. Could you buy up, even if you were doing it totally legitimately for fair prices, could you buy up all the land in Israel and keep it? Why not? Well, every 50 years, but you're right, the Jubilee, every Jubilee, all land reverts back to its original owners. Leviticus 25, verses 23 through 28. All land was supposed to revert to its owner in the year of Jubilee. But what we got here is people taking it for themselves and not giving it back. And so what happens, we got adding house to house, joining field to field, until what? Until there's no more room and you get to live alone in the midst of the land. You got the whole land to yourself. Well, that isn't right. And of course, the irony of their punishment in verse 10 is that those who are greedy will not be prosperous. And what we have, 10 acres of vineyard yield only 1 bath of wine. A bath of wine is about 6 gallons. So you think about, think how big of an acre is. It's the size of a football field. You've got all these grapes planted and you only get 6 gallons out of the whole thing. That's not a very good vineyard. An ephah versus a homer. Basically a homer is, an ephah is 1/10 of a homer. So, you plant all the seed and you only get a 10% return for the seed that you planted. So the irony of all this is the worthless vineyard of the earlier part of the chapter is now being punished with worthless vineyards. Verses 11 and 12, woe to those who arise early to pursue strong drink. And, they get up early to drink, they stay up late to drink, they're pursuing wine in great quantities, which leads to a lack of spiritual discernment. Their passion for pleasure squeezes out their passion for God. They spend all their time partying, they have no idea what God's will is. Therefore, it says in verse 13 that they're destroyed for a lack of knowledge. He says something similar in Hosea 4:6. It's not merely enough, of course, to know facts and commandments of God. You must know the God behind those commands. It's our relationship with God that gives life to those commands. But a total lack of knowledge is what leads to destruction. My people are destroyed because they don't know me. They don't know my will for them, God says. That's the kind of judgment that He passes on them. Any comments or questions up to this point? I'm, just going through these woes. And verse 18 talks about woes against arrogance, those who drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood and sin as with cart ropes. What do you suppose that means? Dragging iniquity and sin with ropes and cords. It's the picture we're painting here. Well, maybe we ought to put on our ancient people hats for a moment and think, what would an ancient person be dragging with ropes on a normal basis? Somebody say it? Carts. Yeah, that's possible. Would you be dragging, paper? No.
Drag.
Yeah, big rocks. It's the idea of moving something heavy. This is hard work. Hard labor is you picture these scenes where these ancient people are building a big structure and they're carrying the large blocks by dragging the ropes with them. They're working hard at moving that block. But these people aren't moving a big block of limestone. They're moving what? Sin. It's not that they just casually sin. It's not that they're just leisurely sinning. They're working hard at sinning. They're dragging it with the cords of falsehood. They're dragging it with cart ropes. And their sins are not something that they did accidentally. It's something that they work hard at. They devote their energy to. And verse 19 is a mocking statement from them. They say, let him make speed, let him hasten his work that we may see it. Let the purpose of the Holy One of Israel draw near and let it come to pass that we may know it. Now, they're the ones saying this. They're daring God to punish them, basically. It's a sarcastic statement. And they're using this name, they call him the Holy One of Israel in a mocking way. Yeah, like, let's see the Holy One do anything about this, God doesn't see what we're doing. He's not going to punish us for this. This isn't, why should we worry about God? Let's see Him do something about us. Isaiah, of course, later on in verse 24 says that they're despising the word of the Holy One of Israel. God's holiness is not something to be mocked. It is not something to be ridiculed. It is something to be taken very seriously. Verse 20, those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute light for darkness and darkness for light, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter, calling evil good and vice versa. We don't have that problem today at all, do we? Can't think of any situations possibly where that would be going on. We haven't changed at all, have we? And Isaiah doesn't really elaborate on what specifically they're doing this with, except that he establishes that it is possible for society as a whole to collectively get good and evil confused with each other. Society does not define what is good and evil. Let's get that thing straight right away. There is no way in the world that society, by consensus opinion, can establish what is right and wrong. The only one who has that right, the only one who has that authority is God. And, when we start buying into the cultural mores of our civilization, I believe we do a great disservice to ourselves. We do a great disservice to God who created us to glorify Him. Truth is not established by consensus opinion. It's not like Wikipedia where anybody can come in and just edit it. There is a good and there is an evil, and you must not get those two things confused, God says. Verse 21, woe to those who are wise in their own eyes. Well, if they're wise in their own eyes, why do they need God's wisdom, right? I've already got everything figured out. My experience and my knowledge, my wisdom can get me all the way. No, it can't. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes. Woe to those who claim to be wise. There's no greater sign that you are a fool than that you think you are wise. Being wise in one's...
Legend in his own mind.
Exactly. Being wise in your own eyes. Something that's condemned throughout Proverbs, actually. Chapter 1, verse 7, chapter 3, verse 7, chapter 9, verse 10. There's great danger in being wise in one's own eyes. If you think you're wise, you're probably not. Verses 22 and 23, woes against injustice. Well, heroes in drinking wine. That's an interesting image there. Do we have that in society today?
I want whiskey for my men and beer for my horses.
Yeah, I guess they would have had drinking contests back then, too. That's not something our modern age invented.
The country songs out there talk about that.
Exactly. Heroes in drinking wine. Because why? Because they're heroes because their bad deeds are being praised. But of course, it's as if they got medals for it. Do you get a medal for drinking wine? Well, that would be like what it is. But on the other hand, you're exalting and, making the evildoer out to be heroic. What are you doing to the person who's doing good deeds? Verse 23. Take away the rights of those who are actually in the right.
You're a bigot, you're a homophobe, you're a drinkophobe, you're a whatever.
Yeah, well, there's another issue in which our society gets good and evil confused right there. Those in the right lose their rights, good deeds go punished, and those who are wicked, well, they were able to bribe the judge, so they got off. Society has been turned totally upside down in this picture of Isaiah's. Therefore, verses 24 to 25, we have judgment. In verse 24, the vineyard is burned up. It's consumed. And the reason why is because they've rejected the law. They've rejected the Lord. They've rejected the Holy One of Israel. They despised Him. They thought little of Him. God's anger burns and His hand stretches out against His people. And then we have the thematic statement at the very end of verse 25. For all this, His anger is not spent, but His hand is still stretched out. Remember that statement because you're going to see it a bunch more when you get later on into Isaiah. It appears here in chapter 5, but later on in chapter 9, it's like at the end of every paragraph practically. His anger is still not spent and His hand is still not stretched out. You can find it in chapter 9 in verse 12, in verse 17, in verse 21, and in chapter 10 in verse 4. Spoiler alert, the chapter division between chapter 9 and 10 isn't very good. Just thought I'd mention that now. What does that mean? God has done all these judgments and it says His anger is not spent and His hand is still stretched out. What does He mean by that? Well,
giving us a chance to come back to Him. It sounds like you think it's bad now, it's about to get a whole lot worse.
Yeah, it sounds like, I haven't even shown you half of what I can do to you yet, is more the gist of it. I get. And the reason for this is because it gets reversed later on in Isaiah too. We get to Isaiah chapter 10, for instance. Not Isaiah chapter 10, Isaiah chapter 12. In Isaiah chapter 12, whenever they sing the song of praise, one of the comments that they make at the very beginning of it, I will give thanks to you, O Lord, for although you were angry with me, your anger is turned away, and you comfort me. And so there's this idea of God's anger has been spent. It has been used up, and now God turns and He comforts His people. Then you get into chapter 13 and 14, and we talk about Babylon, and Babylon, he asks the question, as for his stretched out hand, who can turn it back? Not Babylon, Assyria. In verse 27 of chapter 14, the Lord of hosts has planned, and who can frustrate it? And as for stretched out hand, who can turn it back? The idea is that God is not going to revoke what He's going to do in terms of judgment on these nations. So this expression seems to be more of, God's judgment is not going to be revoked. as long as this situation continues. The only thing that's going to turn God's anger away is if the people turn from their sins. Seth?
This may be a stretch, but I see 3 different connections, perhaps.
Ooh. Do share.
Verse 18, where they're dragging the cords of falsehood and sin with the cart ropes. It seems like where he says to put off the sin which so easily entangles us, drop the weights that sin is. I see that in verse 18, where he look to Jesus.
Hebrews 12:1, yeah, okay.
Hebrews 12:1. And then in verse 24, where it says that these people were despising the word, where it means to consider to be nothing. Jesus despised the shame that the world was bringing upon him. He considered the shame of the cross to be nothing. And then down in verse, where was it? 25, the mountains quaking, and the mountains in Hebrews chapter 12. Mountains. And then, I don't know, maybe the Mount Zion, the unshakable nation, perhaps in 26 onwards, all the good things that come.
I neglected to talk about the connections with Hebrews chapter 12 with these 2 Mount Zion passages here in chapter 2. I think I neglected to talk about them last time because we were low on time, but one of the images that, of course, God conveys in all of this is that you're not coming to the mountain of fire, the terrifying mountain. You're coming to the heavenly Jerusalem. You're not coming to the mountain that Israel came to. You're coming to a much better mountain in a sense. And, I do think he's tapping into Isaiah's imagery of the mountains there, definitely in Hebrews 12. I don't know about chapter 5. I got to think about that one. That's interesting. I'll have to think about that. Make a note of that somewhere. And my pen has disappeared. I'll make a note of it later. All right, Hebrews 12. Now, you can have it back. 5 minutes left? Okay, good. We're going to finish. Verses 26 through 30. He will also lift up a standard to the distant nation, and will whistle for it from the ends of the earth, and behold, it will come with speed swiftly. No one in it is weary or stumbles, none slumbers or sleeps, nor is the belt at its waist undone, nor its sandal strap broken. Its arrows are sharp, and all its bows are bent. The hoofs of its horses seem like flint, and its chariot wheels like a whirlwind. Its roaring is like a lioness, and it roars like young lions. It growls as it seizes the prey, and carries it off with no one to deliver it. And will growl over it in the day like the roaring of the sea. If one looks to the land, behold, there is darkness and distress. Even the light is darkened by its clouds. All right, so what is these verses here, what do they teach us about the relationship between God and the rest of the nations? Verses 26 through 30. They have a standard that they can look to, okay. Why is God lifting up a standard for these nations, though? What's the point? What's he doing when he lifts up a standard and whistles for them? Are they going to get together and have a celebration? Are they going to all be best friends with each other, play Pictionary? Or?
It sounds like he's summoning Israel.
Yeah, he's summoning nations to destroy Israel. Now, he doesn't specify in this text what nation he's summoning, but you know history. It's probably Assyria, and because that's what eventually happens: is Assyria comes and destroys the 10 tribes of Israel. But ultimately, what we see later on in chapter 10 and so on is that the nations are ultimately a tool in God's hand. It does not matter what nation we're talking about. God can use any nation He wants to accomplish His purpose. Those nations are ultimately nothing more than tools, though. It's the rod of His anger that He uses for discipline. And those nations ought not... They are at His beck and call. He lifts up a standard and they come. He whistles for them and they come. They really don't have a lot of say in the matter. Their motive they have a say in. But if they boast, if the axe boasts over the one who's wielding it, or the club lifts those who wield it, well, it's going to end badly for Assyria too. We'll see that in chapter 10 as well. We have kind of a mixed metaphor in verses 29 and 30. The army's noise is both like the roaring of a lion and like the roaring of the sea. And the dark image of the sailor looking for land, he's out in his boat, the sea is roaring, and he can't find the land. He looks to the land, but behold, darkness and distress. He looks up, he can't get a fix from the stars as to where he is. The clouds are blocking everything out. He can't see the land. He's totally hopeless and in despair. This is the result of Israel's fruitless behavior. This is the consequence of their sin. This is what Israel is like. Now, again, these first 5 chapters have just been laying the groundwork. Isaiah is saying, this is what's wrong with Israel. You could be like this. You could be like this glorified, glorious Mount Zion. But you are like this instead. And the question that is begged and remaining is, how can this Israel become that Israel? How can the Israel that is so lost in their sins become an Israel that is glorified in the sight of God, that turns to Him and is saved by Him? Well, the answer to that we'll see a little bit of next time when we get into chapter 6. All right, that'll be all for now, and we'll take a little break, and then we'll have our song and short talk.